Okay, yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Do you have a sense of when we might get instruction on how that's going to look? It's just I've started reading some papers and I.
Yes, yes. So the rough instruction is that there would be two parts to the assignment. One part is a presentation. So in the last week of the course, we have 150 minutes, and I'll divide 150 minutes between the number of students that are going to present, and that's the amount of time that each student will present. And except the presentation, there would be also a small report, which basically should emphasize what were the contributions of the paper, and also what criticism do you have, and so on, like thoughts of any shape or form. That's currently what I'm thinking. I might change it a bit. I'll try to provide the instructions in the next few weeks as soon as possible, so that you could start working on it as soon as possible.
Okay. Are you in a place where you would be willing to approve papers just for like consideration?
Yeah, yeah,
Like if I
that's
said,
not a problem. Yeah, I think you sent me a paper, right?
yeah, do you approve of this paper?
Yeah, yeah, I think it looks good. The only it's a bit short, so I'm not sure if there's enough content, but I think it looks good. It looks interesting. I have no problem with the paper, especially if the paper is about your research. Then I definitely have no issues with that.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Um, oh, okay. So let's start. So I'm recording. Yes. So as you might have seen, there was the first coding homework was published. Um, I hope that the level of the homework is not too, difficult. Um, as promised, this homework has under 5 lines of code that you need to write. If anyone has issues, uh, please do contact me, and you can either attend the office hour, which is on Wednesday, or you can just schedule a meeting with me, or you can just email me. For those of you who have, looked at the homework, did it look reasonable to you? Yeah, reasonable. It's okay. I think Neo is saying it's too easy for him. Is that what you're saying? No, no, no. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay. So today I'm going to start talking about the next topic. So the first topic of the course was, oh, you got 97%. Yeah, so if the accuracy is not high enough, that's okay. It's okay. 99% is not really necessary. I got 99% when I trained it, but I think 97 is fine. So the first part of the course um, was about an introduction to deep learning. And hopefully by now you know what a deep network is and how to train it and what are some canonical data sets in deep learning. The next part of the course is going to be about, or about, how Canadians say, mysteries in deep learning. So what are mysteries in deep learning? Mysteries are questions that are interesting for researchers who are currently studying deep networks, right? And today I will start by talking about sparsity and information compression. That's the first mystery. So I'm no neuroscientist, but I thought it would be interesting to review some literature from neuroscience because I think it relates to a big mystery, at least to me, in deep learning. So here you can see a picture of the brain, a human brain. And here you can see the eye, which is looking at some scene, right? Here there's a cat or something. I guess this doesn't look like a cat, but, and then the image of the cat goes into the eye, right? It goes through these visual pathways, and then it reaches what's called the visual cortex, right? And the visual cortex in the brain is processing the input information from the image through several stages, which are called the V1 stage, the V2 stage, the V3 stage, etc. Now, there's lots of different parts. You could spend 1 hour just speaking about the different, structures existing here biologically, but that's not quite my point, right? My point is that the visual cortex, which is processing the input images that you're seeing through your eyes, has different levels of processing, different level of abstraction. And there is a certain theoretical picture that emerges out of neuroscience. And the theoretical picture says that the visual system is learning how to organize itself from images it sees. So in some sense, it's learning without any labels. And that as you proceed through the layers, through the V1, V2, V3, and so on, as you go higher in the abstraction of the brain, you get filters that respond to higher levels of abstraction. So for example, V1 might have very simple filters that look kind of like edges of an image, whereas V2 might have some corners which are constructed from 2 different edges together. V4 might have a face in it, and down the line you can see that there is even higher abstractions, like a specific person, right? Now, this theoretical picture explains how people intuitively also perceive deep networks, right? In deep networks, people have this intuition that the network is learning some type of high-level concepts about images, supposedly. Now, in neuroscience, there's this very famous hypothesis, which is called the efficient coding hypothesis from 1961. And I snapshotted here a small part from Wikipedia that explains what is this efficient coding hypothesis. So the efficient coding hypothesis was proposed by Horace Barlow, probably butchering his name, in 1961 as a theoretical model of sensory coding in the brain. Within the brain, neurons communicate with one another by sending electrical impulses referred to as action potentials or spikes. So you can see this word appear many times in neuroscience, spikes. One goal of sensory neuroscience is to decipher the meaning of these spikes in order to understand how the brain represents and processes information about the outside world. Barlow hypothesizes that the spikes in the sensory system formed a neural code for efficiently representing sensory information. So essentially you have an image of something, and the brain is trying to process the image. And in processing the image, the brain is creating some type of a neural code. Now, notice this extremely important word here, efficiently representing sensory information. So the efficient coding hypothesis is saying that the brain somehow manages to take an input image through the eyes and represent it efficiently in the brain. Now, what does it mean efficient? What does it mean efficiently? So by efficient, Barlow meant that the code minimizes the number of spikes needed to transmit a given signal. So basically, the number of impulses that go between different neurons is supposedly being minimized in the brain. That's why it's efficient. This is somewhat analogous to transmitting information across the internet, where different file formats can be used to transmit a given image. Different file formats require different number of bits for representing the same image at given distortion level, and some are better suited for representing certain classes of images than others. According to this model, the brain is thought to use a code which is suited for representing visual and audio information representative of an organism's natural environment. So in simple words, what is this saying? It is saying that the brain somehow learns to represent images in an efficient manner, where efficient means that it's as if it requires a very little information to represent the image. So for example, most of you probably know what JPEG is, right? What is JPEG? JPEG is when you take an image and you try to compress the image by representing the image over a different, let's say, basis, right? So essentially, you take an image of a person, you apply some type of a algorithm, and after you apply the algorithm, your signal becomes very compressible because it only requires, let's say, 3 bits to represent. Okay, so this is the efficient coding hypothesis. Now, the hypothesis, as the name suggests, one can construct many hypotheses. The question is whether there is actual evidence that supports the hypothesis. So in 1959, Hubel and Wiesel did an experiment. So what they did is they took a poor cat and they showed to the cat images of this type of, I guess it's called stimulus, right? So you project on top of a screen this type of bars, right? And you try to, either rotate the bar, like you can see here, or maybe translate it in terms of the location. And then, why is this cat poor? Because you try to record from this poor cat's brain what is happening in the V1 part of the visual cortex. Does the experiment make sense? Yes, okay. And what they found was that in the V1, yeah, it is very poor. In the V1 part of the brain, what the researchers found was that there were neurons which were firing for a specific angle. So this is what's called orientation selectivity. Do you see this? Orientation selectivity in V1. So you can think of it as there is a neuron in the brain which fires once you show the cat this filter. And other filters which are resembling this filter, like this filter, right? It's close in angle, they also fire, but less. And filters which are close to orthogonal don't fire at all, right? So there's filters which are selective of different orientations. Now, why is this interesting? Because in 1987, there was a very famous paper by David Field, who's a famous neuroscientist, which basically showed that natural images are, so you could ask the following question: what kind of statistics do natural images have? What kind of a distribution? And in this paper by David Field in 1987, what he showed was that the natural images tend to have coefficients which are non-Gaussian. So if you look, for example, at an image, right? You take an image of, you know, something, let's say a tree and a house, and then you encode it. Encode means that you represent it over some basis, for example, and then you get a certain vector, right? A vector V for this image. And then imagine you repeat this many times and you get a bunch of vectors V. And you try to check, is this vector V following, for example, a Gaussian distribution? Or is it following a distribution that is known to people, right? And what Field found was that the distribution of these images, of natural images, were non-Gaussian, and they were actually linear on a log scale, right? And the fact that they're linear on a log scale indicated to him that essentially it means that the log probability is equal to some linear function. And this implies that the probability is something like a Laplace distribution. So a Laplace distribution is something that has a very sharp peak at 0 and decays very rapidly, right? So a lot of the distribution is concentrated around the origin, okay? And then in 1996, the same person, Field, and also Olshausen, wrote a very famous paper, which is called Emergence of Simple Cell Receptive Field Properties by Learning a Sparse Code for Natural Images. Oh, there was a question, like Dirac delta. It's not quite like Dirac delta. It's basically, it's similar to a Dirac in the sense that there is a lot of energy at a single place, but it's not like it's a single peak. It's more like it's rapidly decaying, right? Exactly, x to the minus a, absolute value x, yes. Yes. And just to clarify again, the x here that J. Kang, hopefully I'm pronouncing correctly, wrote, the x is basically these representations of an image over a certain basis, right? So you can think of it as the coefficients of an image. So then came this seminal paper. Oh, there are different representations for an image that you can construct, and you can ask yourself, for each representation of an image, how would the coefficients behave? I'm not sure if they write here which representation they use. They say amplitude spectra for the 6 images average across all spectra. Yeah, they don't write here, but yes, Gina, there are different representations of an image. Like, can anyone give me a representation that they know of an image? It does depend on the encoding. Yeah, so bitmap is one representation. What would ImageNet is not a representation, no. Random transform, wavelet, yes. So the Fourier, exactly, Fourier. Exactly. So these are different representations of an image, right? And you could ask yourself, how do the distribution of the coefficients under these representations look like? So in the case of Fourier, it's very easy. What are the coefficients in the case of Fourier? So you take your Fourier transform and just apply it on the image X, and then you get the representation V, right? So this would be the representation that I'm talking about. I'm not sure exactly which base, I don't remember which basis they used in this specific figure, but I can check later. So if in 1996, there was this famous paper, which is called The Emergence of Simple Cell Receptive Field Properties by Learning a Sparse Code for Natural Images. And essentially in this paper, what the authors showed was that if you take a bunch of natural images, small images, patches of images, and you try to learn a representation of these images together with the transformation, while enforcing some type of a sparsity promoting function on the representations, you would get the type of filters that you see in the V1 area of the brain. So here's first of all a picture. So they showed that these type of filters, which are the filters that you see in the brain, right, can be reproduced in code using an algorithm by trying to represent images over some basis sparsely. So let me show you here's the optimization algorithm they considered. So they took a bunch of patches xi from natural images, and they tried to represent them as a multiplication of some matrix W and some coefficients alpha, right? So xi is an image, W is a matrix that you can think of it as the set of columns that are going to build your image. These are also called atoms sometimes. And alpha I are the representations. So for example, you could place here, instead of W, you could place the Fourier matrix, right? Or the wavelet matrix, so those of you who know wavelets. You can put here any matrix that you want. And alpha is a vector of coefficients, okay? So if you multiply a matrix by a vector of coefficients, you're essentially creating a linear combination of the columns in the matrix W. Now, what's important here is that notice that we're trying to optimize over both W and alpha. So because we're optimizing over both W and alpha, it means that we're both trying to find the transformation, right? The transformation W, and also the representation over this transformation. Now, as you can see, there's also here an L1 penalty on the representations. So this is basically an L1 norm. And in their paper, as far as I remember, they didn't actually, really explain why would you use an L1 norm here. But over the years, people understood that an L1 norm is basically related in a Bayesian sense to the Laplace distribution, right? So essentially this L1 norm, as Amir Reza says, is going to promote sparse outputs. It does not guarantee a sparse output, but it promotes it. So let me try to explain again what is the relation between everything, because I feel like this is a lot of information. So here's again an overview of the idea. So in the visual cortex, there is different stages of processing. One of the stages that is the one that was perhaps most studied is the V1 area of the brain. Now, the V1 area of the brain contains edge detectors, right? You can see them here. This is the V1 area. You can see it contains edge detectors. And you could ask yourself, why would there be edge detectors in the V1 area of the brain? That's a legitimate research question, right? Why does edge detector appear in the first part of your brain? It's an interesting question, don't you think? So people, first of all, said, okay, I'm going to take a cat and I'm going to look at what kind of filters there are in V1. And they saw that there are edge detectors, right? So that's an empirical observation they made. They saw that the first part of the cat brain indeed has different edge detectors in different orientations. After that, they started wondering, why would these type of edge detectors appear? So they proposed a way to create them empirically in code. So they created a simple code, a simple optimization problem, right, that would generate the same type of filters that are observed in the brain of a cat, for example. And as a result, they obtained, this is, for example, in MATLAB, right, or Python, they managed to obtain the same type of filters that they saw in the lab in the cat. To the person who's asking, Tina, if this is like compressed sensing, this is very related to compressed sensing. Compressed sensing is not learning this transformation, but it is using a random transformation, and it does minimize an L1 norm. So it's highly related. And then Amireza says, is it the same on the practical deep network? Okay, so we'll talk about the deep network in 1 minute. So the whole point was the creation of an optimization algorithm that generates the same type of filters that you see in the brain, in the V1 area of the visual cortex. Does anyone have any questions? I sense some confusion among the participants. It's not what the brain sees, it's rather the brain has different filters in it. It has different processing stages in it. One of the processing stages is the V1 stage in the visual cortex. And the V1 stage is a stage that has very well-known filters, which are edge detectors. They have orientation selectivity. And you might ask yourself, why do those filters emerge in the first stage of the brain? And the efficient coding hypothesis says that maybe it emerges because you're trying to create some type of an efficient representation of your data, right? And that's why Olshausen and Field said, okay, let's try to take a bunch of images and let's try to see what happens if we try to represent them efficiently, right? This is efficiently. I guess I'm missing a C, efficiently. Why is this efficiently? Because if you have an L1 penalty on the representations alpha, then those representations are going to be sparse. There's only going to be a few of them which are going to be on, right? And in some sense, this shows that the empirical coding hypothesis is correct in that it produces the same type of filters that you see in the actual brain. I'm not sure how does the cat reaction time relate to the filters exactly. I'm not sure how to answer that question. In the experiments where the vectors in W incline, exactly, yes. But notice, Amireza, that this is trained, this is optimization, right? This slide is talking about an optimization problem that was run in Python or MATLAB, whereas in the cat experiment, the inclined bars were fixed. they were just images, right, that were fixed and shown to the cat. Yeah, that's essentially the hypothesis, that the brain learns itself. W takes the representation and produces the image. So W is, one second. So W takes the representation and produces the images. Yes, yes, exactly. Because W takes the representation alpha I, and then you get the image xi, right? So your sentence is correct. And you're asking the first L2 norm calculates how good the representation is. Exactly. It's also called reconstruction error sometimes by certain people. The second L1 norm measures sparsity. That is correct. And the reason L1 norm is related to sparsity is because the L1 norm is related to the Laplace distribution, and the Laplace distribution is a distribution that has a lot of its probability around the origin. Towards the end of the course, I'll actually formalize some of these ideas because people have spent approximately 20 years writing applied math papers on this subject. So there's actually proper math that, you know, explains all of this properly. It's just that at this point, I want to show you some interesting research that was done in neuroscience and how it possibly relates to deep learning. The lambda is a parameter that weights these two quantities, and essentially the magnitude of lambda is what dictates how sparse your solution is going to be. Each xi is not a column of an image, it's a patch from the image. It's like a small portion from an image. You can think of it as being one training example, one small image of MNIST or one small image of CFAR. Does this make sense? Look. Yeah, exactly. Vectorize the image. Exactly. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Okay. So afterwards, what happened was that people realized that there is two important things when you're trying to create these filters in the V1 area of the brain. The first one is that you want your representations to be sparse. The second property that's important is over-completeness. So you want your matrix W in the previous slide actually not to be a square matrix like a Fourier matrix, but you want it to be very, very wide, a wide matrix, over complete matrix. Oh, I'm not, so there is a question by Karen. I'm not really sure if I phrased my question in an answerable way. Can you explain how the matrix W related to the right-hand side graph of the cat experiment? Yes. So in the cat experiment, they were just checking a hypothesis, which is they believed that the cat neurons in V1 would respond to these type of images, right? So what is the relation between W and these images? If you take these images and you vectorize them, you get a column vector, right? Column vector. If you vectorize them. And then if you concatenate all of these into a matrix, you get something that's analogous to W. So W contains in its columns the vectorized versions of these images. I feel like I've confused even more. No, doesn't make sense. Maybe you can ask using words. Maybe that would be more. Oh, we can't hear you. I think you have issue with your sound. Okay, that's why you're not using your words.
Is this better? Can you hear me?
I can hear you very softly.
I'll try to speak up. So
Yes.
on the right hand side, there is some kind of graph here with time and seconds, and it's kind of unclear to me. I mean, if you vectorize the left hand side and put it into W, how does that take into account the information on the rightmost representation?
Oh, I see, I see, I see. So on the right-hand side, these quantities are essentially analogous to alpha, except that here your alpha is changing with time, right? So essentially, if you take, for example, a single column here, then you would get, a vector which has entries here, and everything else is 0, right? And this is essentially alpha. And this alpha is multiplying this W to create the image, supposedly. Does this make sense or no? Yeah. I mean, I'm just explaining the intuition in neuroscience. Like, this is not a proper mathematical statement. It's an experiment that people did. They were trying to understand, what's happening in the V1 area of the brain. And they found that there is a set of filters, and you can arrange those filters into a matrix and think of it as a basis. So Reza is asking, is W fixed in the brain, or does the brain learn it over time? I'm not sure. I think that the hypothesis is that it learns it over time, but I'm not sure. I think we should ask a proper neuroscientist that question. It's a very interesting question. So notice that in this optimization problem, we were thinking of W as a set of columns. W is a matrix whose columns are, some type of filters, right, that create an image through a linear combination. And it turned out that this W does not actually need to be a square matrix. You can make it actually non-square. You can make it very wide, over complete. And if you make it over complete, it makes your representation even sparser. Because the more columns in W you have, the more, the sparser you might be able to represent a new image, right? Because you have more possibilities to pick from the columns. Does this intuition make sense? So essentially, over completeness, in some sense, goes hand to hand with sparsity. Now, how is any of these? Oh, did someone want to ask a question? No. So how is any of this related to deep learning, right? This is a deep learning course, not a neuroscience course. So essentially, if you look at the first layer of, for example, an AlexNet network, in the first layer of an AlexNet network, you find the same type of filters that you might find in the V1 area of the brain, or the same type of filters that you find once you impose, once you try to learn, sparse representations with an overcomplete basis. So for example, here you can see, obvious filters which have orientation selectivity. Okay, so how do you visualize the first layer? What are these images is a wonderful question. So imagine that you take the first layer in a convolutional network, right? So what is going to be the dimension of the first layer in a convolutional network? So the first so let's say conv1, this is related to the homework coding exercise. What would be the dimension of conv1? So conv1 would have a certain amount of filters, right? How many filters? Let's say it has, I don't know, 128 filters. And then each filter has 3 channels because it's RGB. And each filter is a size of, let's say, 11 by 11, right? So notice that in order to visualize this layer, you can create 128 different boxes, which are the different boxes that you can see here. Like this is box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4. Each one of those boxes is an image of size 11 by 11 with 3 channels, which are RGB. Does this answer the question, Amireza? You understand this? Okay, so, oh, but you have a question, okay. Not convinced, what are these? I'm not sure what do you mean by not convinced, what are these? Output images. So a convolutional layer has filters associated with it, right? A convolutional layer in a convolutional neural network has filters that are being dot producted with different patches in the image. So what's being shown here are the filters of a convolutional module, the weights that are being learned by stochastic gradient descent. So, you know, the first question we should be asking ourselves, the first mystery to me, these are filters, that is correct, filters. Because each one of those, if you have a convolutional layer, kernels, filters, yes, 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 learned weights, yes, yes, yes. Well, everything everyone's saying is correct. There are filters, there are kernels, there are learned weights. Because if you have a conv1 layer with 128 appearing in the first number, it means that you have 128 filters or 128 kernels, right? So the first question that one should be perhaps asking themselves, the first mystery, is what causes orientation selectivity that we saw in the V1 area of the brain, in the poor cat, and that we were able to reproduce by training a, you know, a base, an overcomplete basis with sparsity promoting norm. What causes all of this to appear in the first layer filters of a deep network? Neo says, our brain used these slanted slits to detect orientation and edge in V1. Yes, 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 yes. So does the first mystery make sense? Is this, you know, is it trivial to anyone? Maybe someone can tell me what's the answer to this mystery. We can write a paper. No, no. So if you have thoughts, let me know. So the next thing you might do is you might say, okay, so we can visualize the first layer fit. Oh, is this an open question? As far as I know, it's an open question. So Lemont is asking, is the first layer believed to only contain these sort of filters, or are there theories that it does more than just detect orientations? I think it's not, I think it's an open question. I'm not aware of, you know, research that on this topic. So I'm not sure if it should contain only these sort of filters or not. It's unclear as far as I can tell. So the next thing you might try to do is you might try to visualize other types of layers, not just the first convolutional layer, right? But what is the problem with visualizing other layers? Does anyone know? If you try to visualize, let's say, layer number 2 or 3 or 4, what issue would you stumble upon? I don't think it does that. Yeah. maybe you can see a filter chocolate. So intermediate layers of the network may not be invertible. What does RUB mean? Oh, exactly. They're not RGB because the next layer, the next convolutional layers would not have a 3 here. They would have something different, like 64 or 256 or something like that. So essentially, how does one visualize an image of size 11 by 11 by 256? Right? It's unclear. You cannot visualize. You can visualize 3 channels, right? You can visualize maybe a channel at a time. Another problem is that, yeah, I guess that's the main problem. Is that why we see psychedelic colors in network can visualize in grayscale? You can visualize in grayscale, that is correct, but you would have to visualize only one slice and you would basically see nothing there. Can you use hexadecimal encoding for colors? So another issue I should mention is that usually the convolutional layers have 3 by 3 here, right? Not 11 by 11. So if it's 3 by 3, it's like 9 numbers. So it's a very long filter, right? Many channels and it's very small. So I'm not even sure if it's possible to see anything there. So Xiaoding, I'm not sure what hex encoding for colors, I do know what it means, but I'm not sure how does that allow you to visualize it any better. But I guess you could try and propose different ways of visualizing filters. You could try to do that. The question is whether you would see anything interesting. So what people in deep learning have tried to do instead was to do something called activation maximization. So what activation maximization is doing is it's solving the following optimization problem. So imagine we take a certain network which has parameters theta, and we push to the network an image X, right? And in this network, imagine you have many layers. So this is a fully connected layer, let's say. This is another fully connected, and so on. So a very complicated network. Imagine that you take one, in each one of these stages, you have a certain representation, which we denoted by H or Z, right? Imagine you take this H and you pick a specific neuron there, just one neuron that you believe in, right? Just pick one entry, and then you try to force the HL is a representation at the Lth layer of this input image X with the network parameters theta. You try to force it to be a one-hot vector. So you're essentially trying to make it so that the neuron would be as close as possible to the one-hot vector, right? So what's the optimization variable? The optimization variable is the image, or how it's called here, a pre-image. So this optimization problem is trying to find an image that would activate as strong as possible or as close as possible to a one-hot vector in a certain neuron in a certain layer, right? Now, in practice, people cheat a bit and add it's called in image processing prior, but it's basically making the image look more natural, more nicer, so to speak, right? So in practice, if you just try to do minimize the first objective, you might get images which are not so pretty. So people add some type of a extra term that makes the images look better. So the reason you're interested in this problem is because you're trying to figure out what is a certain neuron in a network, corresponding to. Imagine that you take a deep network, right? And you ask yourself, what is a neuron in the 5th layer doing? When does it fire? what excites it, right? So what you might do is you might try to find an input X that would make that neuron as close as possible to being 1, and all the rest of the neurons in that layer being as close as possible to being 0. And so this is the optimization problem. It's like an inverse problem, exactly, except that it's a highly nonlinear inverse problem, right? It's actually, it's literally an inverse problem in the classical image processing sense, because you have here the log probability of your image, and you have this degradation model, which is the loss. So it is literally an inverse problem, yeah. And so you try to find an X, right? And then how do we solve this optimization problem? Does anyone have any suggestion for how to solve such an optimization problem? This is a crazy optimization problem where you're trying to find an input that excites a neuron deep inside the network. So you need to calculate the derivatives, and yeah, so just use gradient descent. And how do you calculate the gradients with respect to X? PyTorch, yes. Tristan is has already understood the essence of deep learning. Exactly. Backward, yes, yes, backward. Don't forget the backward, right? So at this point, you might try to take this algorithm, right? This is an algorithm that obtains as input two inputs. What are the two inputs to this algorithm? The two inputs are the layer, right? The layer number, and also the index of a neuron. So you might try to visualize the first filter in the first layer. Do people again use neural networks to find this minimum? What do you mean by use neural networks to find this minimum?
I mean, like, this is just an optimization problem, right? Like,
right.
Would they use neural networks, or would they just use some more classical techniques?
So notice that this HL as function of X theta is a certain representation deep inside a network, right? Are you asking if you can solve this optimization problem using a neural network? Or are you asking how does this relate to neural nets?
I'm asking, like, if people use neural networks to solve this problem in practice.
I don't remember seeing a work that proposed to solve this using a neural network. But you do understand that this thing is a representation inside a network, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay, I got you. So I haven't seen a person try to solve this using a neural network. I haven't seen. It would be like using a neural network to study a neural network, yes. So I was saying that this algorithm has two inputs to it. The first is the layer, and the second is the index of the filter. And here's what you get if you solve the optimization problem. So here you can see conv1. Conv1 is the first convolutional layer. Then you have conv2, which is the second convolutional layer. So in the first convolutional layer, you can see how there's edge detectors like this one, right? In some cases, you get edge detectors which have color, right? Red on one side, blue on the other side. And in some cases, you get, I guess, more than one edge. So it becomes essentially like a filter that you would see in a Fourier matrix. Yes. Then there's the second layer. In the second layer, you can see how more complicated patterns emerge. So for example, you can see here some highly non-trivial pattern emerges. Here you can see some highly non-trivial pattern, right? And so on. By the third layer, by the third layer, you start seeing very complicated structures, very complicated. It's not even clear what they are. In the fourth layer, we start seeing objects, right? Here I can see what seems to be a donkey. To me, it's a donkey. I'm not sure what it is to you. Here you can see, I think it's a flamingo, and so on, right? And in the fifth layer, you can see, I guess, more objects. There's a different visualization here. This is a different, it's a hippo. Okay, I'm sorry. In a different network, you can do the same thing and see different type of visualizations. And essentially, what this shows is that indeed, deep inside a network, you manage to find some type of a neuron which is responsible for detecting certain objects, right? So in some sense, this is empirical evidence that would support the efficient coding hypothesis, because the efficient coding hypothesis is saying that deep inside a network, you would see neurons which are very specific to a certain object. Like the efficient coding hypothesis is saying that you can take an image with a house and a tree, right? And you can encode it into a very sparse network, a very sparse representation, sorry, where you would have here something like a tree, right? A neuron corresponding to a tree, and here a neuron corresponding to a house. So to me, it seems like this is trying to tell you that the efficient coding hypothesis, at least empirically, is correct. Tristan is asking, so this is done using some prior to make the images look good, right? Yes, that is right. How do we know we aren't just seeing the effect of the prior and this has nothing to do with the filters themselves? The priors that people are using here are extremely simple priors. So for example, there would be a total variation prior, right? A total variation prior is promoting images which are, let's say, piecewise constant. So it's a very weak prior, so to speak. Like the priors that are being used are not capable of generating such rich structures. People have spent a lot of time, like insane amount of energy in image processing, studying what exactly are these priors doing. And so because of that, they understand that these priors could not possibly generate such cool stuff. Okay, so here you can see what happens if you try to do the activation maximization algorithm on the last layer of the network. So for example, you could try to say, oh, I think Shia wants to ask a question. No. So here you can say, for example, AlexNet, can you show me how does a tree frog look like? And you can see here something that looks like a frog, right? Then you can tell the network, can you show me how does a black swan look like? And I guess you can see a swan. I like the cheeseburger because you can definitely see a cheeseburger here. Now, notice the fact that the visualization are showing not only one cheeseburger, but there is a bunch of them, right? And this seems to indicate that if you want to maximally activate the cheeseburger class, you would have more than one cheeseburger in the image, right? You would have a bunch of them spread around. Jay Kang is asking, a single neuron might be fired by a combination of various features. If we somehow penalize the correlation between nodes, does the visualization begin to make more sense? I'm not sure what do you mean by penalize the correlation between the nodes. I guess you could make different variations to these visualization algorithms, and you could get more beautiful visualizations. So what, you're asking what is, so if you remember, a network starts with an input X, right? And then you push it through these many layers. Exactly, and then you get the logits, which is, let's say, 1,000 classes in the case of ImageNet. And this activization maximization algorithm is just working on the logit, trying to maximize that. Does a clear image correspond to a more effective network? Yeah, so there's been research on this exact question, Xiaoding. Does a clear image correspond to a more effective network? So I would say it's an open question. I would say it's an open question. Actually, I saw a paper that claims that the clearer the image, the less effective the network. So I don't know. But I would say it's completely open question. But I think, again, there are no chocolate cookies. So essentially what this shows is that the network does manage to compress a class into a neuron, right? And that in different stages of the network, you get different types of abstractions, which essentially show that you have managed to encode the image, right, in a meaningful manner. Wouldn't it be problem-specific cleaner, not cleaner images? I'm not sure what do you mean by problem-specific cleaner, not cleaner images. The clearer the image, less effective the network is because of the generalizing error. They have been, yes, Neil, they have been. Yeah, so the networks do allow for different angles and positions of the objects because the data set contains objects in different angles, positions, and so on. So it's essentially baked into the training data set. And also, in practice, people usually perturb the images or flip them or translate them slightly. And this creates a richer data set where the richness of the data set reflects this type of invariances that you're talking about, Gina.
But is that why they look like that here? Like, is this holding all of the different positions of the goose, for example?
I think if I asked you, Gina, you know, imagine a goose, then you would probably imagine one goose. But if I asked you, imagine the image that would represent as much goose as possible to you, right? So maybe you would draw more than one goose, right? I think that's why you see many geese here. It also implies that the network learned to, you know, different angles and positions of the objects. I guess that's what you're saying. Yeah, yeah. Yes. So, okay, so at this point, we know that a network has edge selectivity in the first layer, right? And edge filters are very general filters. They would be useful in many tasks, right? And so what people have been doing in deep learning is they've been doing something called transfer learning, where you train a network on a certain data set, and then you try to use the same network on a different data set, or only a subset of the network on a different data set. Ichao asks, if you use a different loss function, will you still have the first layer edge detectors? I believe so, but I can't think of a reference from the top of my head, but I believe so. So what this specific paper did was they tried to understand how effective is transfer learning. So they did the following experiment. Imagine you take two data sets, data set A and data set B, right? Which are originating from a bigger data set. And so A and B are roughly following the same distribution, right? So imagine you train a network on the data set B and you get the following point here. This is the accuracy, and the accuracy is somewhere around 62%, right? Then imagine that you take the network that you trained on dataset B and you chop the top of the network, meaning that you reset the parameters there, and then you train them on dataset A. So again, you take a network, you train it on dataset B. After you trained it on dataset B, you reset the parameters at the top, at a certain number of layers at the top, and then you train it on dataset A. Now, you can chop a different number of layers, and that's the x-axis here, right? So if you can see here, there's a blue curve, and this blue curve shows how does the performance of the network behave once you chop different types of layers at the top. So for example, if you only chop, the last layer, and then you retrain the last layer on a new dataset A, you would get basically the same performance. But if you chop, let's say, more layers, if you chop something like 3 layers or 2 layers, then you train it on a new dataset A, you would get significantly worse performance, right? So it seems like if you chop a certain number of layers, yeah, exactly, Kevin. They're chopping from the last layer backwards. Now, if you chop, for example, almost all layers except the first layer, right? And then you retrain it on dataset A, you get basically the same performance. Now, another experiment they tried was chopping a certain number of layers and then training not only those layers on a new data set, but training all layers on a new data set. Why is a very good question. So a lot of research in deep learning is doing this type of experiments and trying to think to yourself why, So that's a very representative, I guess, experiment from the deep learning literature. So another thing you might do is you might take your network, chop a certain number of layers, right? Reset them, and then train everything on a new data set. In that case, they observed that you get this curve. So basically nothing is changing in terms of performance, roughly the same. No, it's the same classes. The same classes. Another thing they tried was, for example, training on one data set, and then so you have different options. You can either train on A and then try to train on B, or you can try to train on A and train on A again, and so on. So for example, the curve here corresponds to when you try to train again on the same data set. That's why it's called Selfer BNB. You train on B, chop the top, train on B again. And so essentially what these plots are showing, I guess it's rather complicated to look at all of these plots, but the message is that if you take a data set and then you try to transfer your network to the same type of distribution, then your performance is actually going to improve. So this transfer learning actually improves the accuracy of the network. And the reason why this transfer learning works in practice is because your network contains in the earlier layers some features which are very general, right? Like the edge detectors. And if you go to deeper layers, then your network contains filters which are less general and more specific to the task at hand. And so if you were trying to, transfer your network that was trained on geese to a new data set which has no geese, then your performance will decrease, right? Does this make sense? Does anyone have any questions about what transfer learning is? These results are only for when they come from the same, yes. In this specific case, yes, A and B come from the same distribution, yes. If I remember correctly, the classes are the same for A and B. Does this say that training on B first and then A is just overall worse? So let's see, A and B. It's not overall worse because so this curve, do you see this curve, which is improving? This curve corresponds to training on, if I remember correctly, training on B and then transferring your network to A. But after you transfer the network to A, you fine tune all the parameters there. The descriptions of the experiments are extremely complicated, I do realize. Okay, but what's important to understand is not the specifics of the experiments. What's important to understand is that early in the network, there are filters which are very general, like edge detectors. Deeper in the network, there are filters which are very class specific, like a goose detector, right? And so when transferring, people have learned to chop somewhere, chop the top layers, which are class specific, and use the earlier layers on the new data set. So Neo says, if you transfer a general layer, the performance will not get too much worse, but if you transfer a data specific layer, your experiment will show worse performance. Exactly, yes, yes. And this is a technique to, for instance, show the edge detector. Yes, exactly, yes, 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 yes. But there is also a nuance here, which is, are you training all the networks after you transfer, or are you only training the top layers? That's why you have a plus here. A plus indicates that you're training all the layers. Amireza says, to conclude, chopping and retraining the last layer in a different set always results in a network with more generalization. Yes, 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 yes. Can we do it for several times? I'm not sure what does it mean for several times. I mean, I would caution you always, always take everything with a grain of salt. This is an empirical paper, an empirical plot, right? One thing that you see here might not generalize. So before you conclude about some general rule, you should make sure that at least the empirical phenomenon happens, in different cases, right? Okay, so essentially the question that I want to, or the mystery that I want to highlight is, can you somehow explain, in a proper manner, why and when is transfer learning beneficial? We understand intuitively that earlier layers are general, later layers are specific to the problem, but is there some more fundamental information, some more fundamental understanding of what does it even mean to be, tailored specifically to the problem that you're facing? Like, how do you formalize any of this, right? That's in my mind a mystery. So essentially what we've seen in the previous, up to now, I guess, is that networks are capable of representing high-level abstractions deep inside a network in a compressed manner, right? So there is a neuron which corresponds to a certain class. Now, there are people who were trying to understand if there's some type of, is there some type of a sparsity in the network, or is there some type of low dimensionality in the network? It seems like a network is able to represent images in a, if you go deep inside a network, they manage to represent images in high level concepts, right? And so you might think to yourself that maybe a network has some type of inherent sparsity or low dimensionality to it. And so some people were trying to understand what would happen if, for example, I trained the network and I constrained the network parameters to be in some low dimensional subspace. So imagine that you try to train a network, so you minimize the loss function of your parameters theta, right? Where theta can be written, so subject to a constraint where theta can be written as some p times alpha. So p is some random matrix that looks like this. So it's a very tall matrix, and alpha is a very short vector, and this is theta. So this is p and alpha, right? So this is essentially saying that the network parameters are restricted to some low dimensional subspace. Now, a priori, why would this work? There is no reason to believe. But what people have found is that for some reason, if you restrict the dimension of your parameters to something like several hundreds, you can still train a network to very high accuracy. So what does this imply? It implies that in some sense, there is some inherent low dimensionality to the network. But it's not really clear what is this low dimensionality in the network, right? There's other, perhaps more clear papers, such as this one. So this paper is called the Lottery Ticket Hypothesis, Finding Sparse Trainable Neural Networks. In this paper, what they found was that you can take a network and you can throw somewhere around 90% of all the parameters of the network and obtain a much sparser network that performs as well as the original network. So essentially, if you have some, function x theta, x is the input of your network and theta are the parameters. So you can set many of these parameters, something like 90% of the parameters, to be 0 without actually suffering a lot of performance degradation. Yes, Neo, exactly what you said. Is another way of looking at the low dimensionality problem as low dimensionality of the input manifold? It's not clear. It's not clear. Maybe. This is why I'm saying it's a mystery, right? If I knew how to answer your beautiful questions, it wouldn't be a mystery. So it's not clear what kind of, how do you formalize, the low dimensionality of the network parameters. Do they restrict the parameter space to lower dimension at the training, or do they do dimensional after during the training? So it seems like we have some questions about this paper. During the training. So what's the implication of low dimensionality in the network? It seems like you have this highly over-parameterized network, right? Which has tens of millions. I just saw the other day that Google trained a network which had, I think it was 1.6 trillion parameters. 1.6 trillion parameters, infinite parameters, right? Being trained. And then you stop and ask yourself, do we actually need all of these parameters? Are they actually training something there? Is a certain neuron in this network meaningful, right? There's different things that could happen. You could have that all of these neurons are meaningful. All of them represent some, some face or some dog or some hippo. Or it could be the case that, a subset of those neurons is meaningful and most of them are just training garbage in the sense that they don't actually capture anything. Or it could be that none of them in practice are actually capturing meaningful information, right? All of these are possible scenarios. All of these are possible hypotheses. Exactly, yes. It does speak to the inefficient structure of the network. Because if you find, for example, that, in this specific case, we find that if you train a network with a subspace of, let's say, approximately 300, I guess it is, if you train the net with a subspace of dimension 300, you can still reach a very high accuracy. So it means that all of these parameters that you're using during training are actually not useful. So there is definitely some type of inefficiency that's happening here. And it's not very clear whether it's needed, this inefficiency, or what is its role. And this, inherent low dimensionality in the network has different facets. So this is one paper that shows that the network is somehow inherently low dimensional because you can project the parameters to a low dimensional space. And this is another type of paper that shows the same thing, right? Because it shows that you can take your parameters, you can set many of them, like 90% of the network you can set to 0. 90% of the parameters of the network can be set to 0 without affecting too much the performance of the network. Okay, so here's an experiment, for example, that they do in this paper, in this lottery ticket hypothesis. So what they show, would that happen to be the case for the brain? I'm not sure. I think that you don't use a large portion of your brain. I think it's a well-known phenomenon that a large portion of the brain is not used. So I guess that might be correct for the brain as well. So in this specific experiment, you can see that they manage, so you can see here the training iterations versus the test accuracy. And for example, let's see, in red, I guess this is red, or I'm not sure what you would call this color, you can see how you get a very nice performance despite the fact that you're using only 7% of your parameters, right? So again, it shows that there's some type of inherent low dimensionality in deep networks, and that supposedly you don't actually need all of these parameters, supposedly. But in reality, you actually do. And I'll discuss it in the next slides. So here's a summary of the open questions. So the first open question is, what causes orientation selectivity in the first layer of the network? The same type of orientation selectivity that you see in the V1 stage of the visual cortex, and the same type of orientation selectivity that you get as a result of sparsity, of trying to represent sparsely images. The second question is, what causes compression of information in deeper layers? Where compression of information means that you are able to represent using there is a single neuron deep inside the network that, for example, activates for a goose, right? The third question is, why and when is transfer learning beneficial? People have observed empirically that you can chop a network and then train it on new data sets, and that it improves performance. But why? Can this be understood on some fundamental level? The next question is, what does the deep network's intrinsic dimension depend on? It seems like empirical evidence suggests that the network has many parameters, but inherently it is much lower dimension. It has a much lower dimension than the number of parameters. And the question is, what does this intrinsic dimension depend on? How do you characterize it? How do you understand it? And so on. And the last question is, how do you train sparse networks or sparsify networks? So if there is some inherent intrinsic low dimensionality, how do you train networks that would, you know, be sparse or that would be low dimensional? So with this, we move to the next lecture, which is, has a provocative name, I guess, the failure of theory. So a whole other set of mysteries in deep learning is, why are we able to optimize a crazy optimization problem, a non-convex optimization problem, which is extremely high dimensional, using gradient descent without being trapped in things like local minima, right? That's a very important question. So for example, what is the role of the stochasticity of gradient descent? Can you use gradient descent, or do you need stochastic gradient descent? What is the role of different knobs that you have in the optimization algorithm? So many of you asked questions about this in the previous lectures. How important is this? How important is that, right? So all of these are mysteries. Now, there was previous work that tried to understand this question. And one thing that people have converged to is that overparameterization seems to be very important in optimizing deep networks. So here you can see an experiment where they have a single hidden layer network. Single hidden layer means that you have input, then you have a hidden layer, and then you have the output, right? And what they did was they varied the size of the hidden layer, right? So they tried 25 neurons in the hidden layer, 50 neurons, 100 neurons, all the way to 500. For each one of those widths, right, they tried to train a bunch of networks. So training a network is a random process, right? Each time you train, you get to something else. You get to a different place in the landscape. Now, what you can see here is a histogram of the training loss versus how many of the networks converge to such training loss. So for example, if this is, let's pick this thing. So this is 0.09, right? And the color is cyan, which means we have 15 hidden units. So, and here we can see, let's say this is 5. So when we had 15 hidden units, then 5 of the optimizations converged to a loss of 0.09. Now, what can you see based on this plot? Is there something that pops to you immediately? Some observation, some phenomenon that's non-trivial, perhaps even counterintuitive? Is there something here that's interesting in this figure? The more parameters, the less the loss. That is correct. Yes. It is because of the stochastic gradient descent, yes. Because there is a different random elements to the training. One of them is the permutation of the data set. So if you remember, we take a data set and we permute it before we create the mini batches, right? So this permutation is random. And this means that every time you train a network, you would get a different permutation of the data sets, right? Another thing that's random, I guess even more importantly, is the initialization of the network, because you're initializing the network with random noise, right? So you're correct, everyone's correct, that the more parameters, the less the loss, and also the higher the concentration of the loss values, right? what do you mean by simplified deep net training? I'm not sure I understand. Simplified deep net training. Oh, I wrote it in slide. Okay, yeah. Why does over simplify? Simplify, I mean, in the sense that it makes it better. Improve maybe would have been a better verb, right? So if you're optimizing with 25 hidden units, then you get to this type of losses, right? On average, you get to here. But if you have many hidden units, you get on average to a much better loss. So it seems to indicate that the more parameters, the simpler the optimization process. Does this make sense? I guess the verb simplify was a bad choice of word. It is paradoxal. It feels like if you have more parameters, you should have more variance, more room for mistakes. Exactly, that is correct. That's why it's a mystery, right? This is highly non-trivial, highly non-intuitive, makes no sense, right? That is part of the mystery. So the other mystery is overfitting. So here's a, statistics 101 says the following. Imagine you have a model. Imagine your model is polynomial of degree, D, right? Imagine you have data. This is your data, all of these points. And imagine you're increasing gradually the degree of the polynomial. So if your polynomial is of degree 1, you get a line, right? So the line does not fit the data well, right? So you say this is a bad model for the data. It's underfitting. Then if you increase the polynomial, suddenly you get something that fits the data well. So that means that it's a good fit, right? And then if you use a very high degree polynomial, suddenly your polynomial is wacky in the sense that it's just, it's just oscillating very rapidly. And this is called overfitting, right? This is called overfitting. And the state that the polynomial, goes through each one of those points, you hear sometimes people refer to this as interpolation. Interpolation, because it's interpolating the training data. So if I ask you, which of these fits or which of these models would you choose? Which one would you say? If you're not trying to, the middle, right? So it's obvious that the middle one is the correct one, right? Is it completely obvious to everyone that the middle one is the correct one? It's completely obvious, right? And why is it the correct one? Because there's a fundamental principle in statistics, I guess, or in general in life, which is called Occam's razor. So this is Occam. And Occam's razor says, all things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best one. So in this case, simple means that simple in this case corresponds to the degree of the polynomial, right? So the lower degree the polynomial, the simpler the solution. Reading Philosophy of William Occam next week. Wow, that's cool. So essentially, you would be very surprised, right, if I told you that the best model is actually this one. Very surprised, right? So here's an experiment that would, just 1 second. Before I get to that, here's an illustration of these principles. So on the x-axis here, you can see the model complexity. So the model complexity is the degree of the polynomial, right? So here, for example, you have degree 1 polynomial. Here you have a large degree polynomial. Now, there is a standard decomposition in statistics, which is called the bias variance decomposition. And essentially what the bias variance decomposition says is that this is your total error, right? The mean squared error, or whatever error you prefer. And this error can be decomposed into two quantities. The first quantity is called the bias. The bias captures the difference between your, let's say, the difference between the optimal model in your class to the truth. So essentially, if you take the best line out of all possible lines, how well is it going to describe your data? So the bias is essentially going to be very large if your model is very simple. Is everyone familiar with the bias variance, I should ask? Yeah, I don't want to waste time if people know bias variance very well. Not seen it. Okay. Okay, so the bias, you can think of it as knew this once in my life. So did you, what does it mean? I knew this once in my life. Have you forgotten about it? Or you mean you saw it once in your life? Yeah, so the bias is essentially measuring how much error do you have due to the fact that your model is too simple. If your model is too simple, then your bias is going to be very large. If your model is very complicated, then your bias is going to be very small. Because you can see here, right? So if your model is very complicated, then your model is capable to feed the training data very well. That's why the bias is small. The variance, on the other hand, captures how much variability you have due to the large model. If you have a very large model, it's very hard to feed the parameters of the model. And that's why you have the error due to the variance. So I guess you can write a simple equation that would explain this. Let me see if I can write the equation somewhere. So here's a simple equation. If you have the mean squared error loss, it's the expectation of your target y minus a function of your input x squared, right? This is the mean squared error. And you can decompose it into the expectation of f of x minus y plus the, I guess, let's see, plus the expectation of, one second. Oh, I think this is the variance. And you have expectation over the f of x, but I think I'm missing the true function. So here there is a true function, which is f star. F star is the actual function you're trying to learn. And then you have, oh, let me, one second. So you have expectation of f of x minus f star of x. This would be the variance, the bias, sorry. And then you would have the expectation of f of x minus expectation f of x. So this is an example of a bias variance decomposition. So essentially the bias variance decomposition, the bias measures how f star is the ultimate, oh, I guess y should be f of x, you're correct, yes. So f star is the ultimate function, like the correct function, and f of x is the function that you're currently looking at, right? So this is the ultimate one, and this is the one you're currently thinking about, how good it is, right? And this thing is the mean squared error, right? Because you're doing expectation. The expectation is over your x, right? And I think there's a square missing somewhere. FBF star. So essentially, when subtracting,
Like in the,
sorry?
you have expectation of E of f of x minus f star of x squared. in the second one, there's no F star.
Oh, right. There, I think. Oh, but it's because you do the expectation, right? Yeah, the first one is the bias and the second one is the variance. So essentially the first term captures how far away is the expectation of your function from the optimal function. And the more complicated your function is, the smaller this quantity is. The second one captures how much variance you have around the mean. I didn't actually plan to explain this very in detail, but what I'm trying to convey is that there's two terms to the error. One is the bias, one is the variance. The bias is the difference from, basically the difference from the best model in your current class. So here's what's important about this. What's important is that if you train a deep network, right, and you try to increase the number of parameters that you have, so you start with, let's say, a hidden layer of size 4, then you go to 8, 16, and so on, and you track your test error, you can see that the test error actually keeps improving and improving and improving. Why is this strange? Does anyone find this strange, actually?
Usually you wouldn't expect the test error to keep decreasing.
Yeah, exactly. So you would expect something like, something like this, right? If your model is getting much more complicated, you would expect that your test error would start increasing. But in reality, you see that your test error keeps decreasing. And so the mystery is, how come over-parameterized deep networks don't overfit, right? You would expect that if you have many, many, many parameters, you would overfit. So if you remember in the previous lecture, I gave you an example of Google AI, where they were training a model with something like 50 billion parameters. And the data set was something like 20 billion examples, right? So in deep learning, always the size of the model is significantly larger than the size of the data set. And you can see that despite that, the test error keeps improving the larger the network is. Moreover, you can see here how at this point, when you have 32 with 32 neurons, you've reached a point where the training error is actually equal to 0, right? What does it mean for the training error to be 0? It means that we are perfectly classifying all the examples, right? So at this point, you're perfectly classifying all your training data and you get this error. But if you increase the size of the model, your training error is still 0, but your test error keeps improving. Don't you find this strange? A mystery? Andrew agrees it's a mystery. So Neo asked, would it be because the bias is only contributing to the error? The bias is the only thing contributing to the error. I think I haven't seen anyone actually do a proper bias variance decomposition to a deep network. So I don't want to answer without knowing for 100%. Xiaoding asks, is it because more parameters give model more flexibility? I'm not sure, how does one define flexibility? What is flexibility? This is all with the same number of epochs, Karen, yes. That is correct. So it seems like we're out of time. And I'll continue from this point next lecture. So thank you for joining, and I'll stay for questions.
Professor.
Yes.
So the real mystery is not that the testing data got better, but it's the real mystery is not that the training data keeps improving, but the testing data keeps improving. Because the training one, you can just kind of cheat your way through by having more parameters.
I would say there's two mysteries here. The first mystery is that the test improves after that the test always improves, right? Why would the test error always improve? That's kind of strange. If you think of this in terms of the bias variance decomposition, the bias variance decomposition says that if your model complexity is very large, then your variance should increase, right? And what we see is that the variance does not in fact increase. So that's kind of strange. And the second mystery is how come after you reach zero training error, your test error keeps improving? You've managed to fit the training data perfectly. The training error is zero. You're classifying all the images correctly. Yet your model's accuracy on test data keeps improving as you increase the size of the network. Does this make sense?
So the first mystery is why the variance didn't go crazy.
Yeah.
The second one is why the testing data keeps improving. So there are two different mysteries here.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And also there is a fundamental realization here, which is that a network is highly over-parameterized in all the examples that you use in real life, right? So for example, in the in the coding exercise that you are doing, the number of parameters in the network is somewhere in the tens of millions, right? The ResNet 18 architecture is something like 10 million parameters. And the size of the data set is 50,000 examples. So you see that the number of parameters is extremely large compared to the number of examples, yet the network is performing really well.
Yeah, hey, I just wanted to add on there. That was going to be my next question. Is this something that's particular to this example here? Or is this something we've seen across other architectures and problems where there isn't overfitting where we would expect there to be overfitting?
It's a general phenomenon. It's a general phenomenon. In fact, I'll show in one of the following lectures, I'll quantify how much improvement you get for different networks, data sets, and so on. Here, for example, you can see the CIFAR 10 data set. So at 256, you get, zero training error, but you can see, I'm kind of crooked, but you see how you get still small improvements, right? Like these small improvements are extremely significant because this improvement, on CIFAR 10, people are publishing papers based on, like 0.5 increase in accuracy or something like that, right?
Yeah.
if you get increase in performance by scaling your network from width 256 to 4K, I think that's very significant.
Yeah. And what do you make of the idea that maybe if we went to 40K instead of 4, then we would see overfitting?
So that doesn't happen, and that's also a topic that we'll cover in the following lectures. There is a whole research direction by many people who are working on infinite width networks. So they take it to the extreme. They say, okay, if 256 is not large enough and 4K is not large enough, let's go to infinity. And they show that for those infinite networks, supposedly, things become more tractable analytically. So for a deep network, it's very, very hard to say anything, as you might imagine, anything mathematical, right? But if you scale your size of the network to infinity, suddenly you start being able to say, statements of mathematical nature.
I see. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like my explanation of the bias variance was not satisfactory. Let me see if at least, oh yeah, go ahead.
I have two questions.
Mhm.
The first one is, I saw that there's a final project,
Mhm.
and I was wondering if, like, how would that work? Does that mean, for example, one of those mysteries, there's one that really intrigues us, and we ask you what's a paper that we could read on that subject, and then just read it, and then like work out the final project?
Yeah. I was planning on showing papers. So here's the structure of the course. We start with an introduction, right? At this point, you've been introduced. And then I specify some mysteries. And then each week after that is going to be on a specific topic. And for that topic, there's going to be papers related to that topic
I
that
see.
I'm going to specify. But you can say, your papers are boring. I want to talk, I want to read other papers, and you can suggest a paper of your own if you want.
I see.
Also, you can, of course, you can ask me for a paper on a specific topic, and I might be able to suggest something.
Sounds good. My only concern is, what if I was worried about if I have like a really interesting mystery toward the end of the year, then I want to be able to work on it a little bit earlier, because my mathematical background in this area is not very strong. So I would take more time than an average student in this class to complete the project to
Right.
a good level. So I just thought that if I found something, I would just email you immediately, so I could get some work on it.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just send you an email then.
Sounds good.
Okay, my second question is, it seems like a lot of these problems are, there's a lot of more sort of mathematical infrastructures need to be introduced in the middle. Namely, if it sounds like there's a lot of fuzzy kind of ideas. For example, what does it mean for this to be that? And then there's not a specific way to, or mathematical structure to measure it. It's kind of like, for example, if you want to measure information, then what do you mean by information? And then people introduce the concept of entropy and do that. So I realized, is it true that in deep learning, there's a lot of mathematical structure just missing completely?
Yeah, definitely. That's part of the challenge, I would say, exactly what you're saying. Identifying mathematical structures, formalizing mathematical structures. It might seem like, I'm presenting mysteries that are not even mathematically defined, right? Most of these things, it's not like I'm presenting, a conjecture, a mathematical conjecture. It's more like this person, found this interesting, mystery, which everyone found to be very interesting. And, it's kind of an open question.
This is so exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it seems like
I have some questions.
Oh, yeah.
If that's cool. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah.
Great. Sorry about that.
Of
So this thing about sparsity indicates to me that perhaps matrices are not the right tool for the job. And I'm wondering if that is something that researchers are considering, or if that's just too much of a fundamental thing to be picking at.
What would be an alternative to matrices?
Maybe considering, I'm just riffing here, right? But considering like embeddings into Rn, something like this.
I think there's a question of what is the goal? Is the goal to understand the networks, or is the goal to propose a new type of networks? That's the first question I would ask. So if you're proposing to replace the matrices in deep nets, right? Are you proposing it to study existing networks, or to create like this new deep learning?
I guess to create new deep learning.
And so if that's the case, then I would say one must make sure that it's you can efficiently learn, embeddings, for example. And I think that might be problematic. So some theoreticians, for example, there's this general idea that the wider you are, the better your network, the easier the optimization, the better generalization, and so on, right? So then people said, okay, let's take it to the extreme and imagine we have an infinite network, right? But if you have an infinite network, suddenly your parameters are not really a matrix. It becomes a distribution over the weights, right? Like it's not an infinite matrix. It's basically a distribution over the rows of the matrix. So that's a different type of beast, right? It's not a matrix, it's something else. But then how can you optimize over that, right? It's not clear.
Right.
But I like your idea. I definitely like the idea. And I think maybe there's some truth to that. Yeah, maybe matrices are not the correct object.
All right. And just before I ask more painful questions, I'm hoping to get a sense from you of the level of rigor that I'm supposed to sort of absorb from today's lecture. And I was going to ask like really detailed cat questions. Should I hold off? Like I get the general idea.
Yeah, you
But I'm
can ask
wondering if-
questions. Yeah, shoot.
So when I was bugging you about the cat example and you were drawing sort of cross sections of the rightmost graph, you were saying, sorry, I'll let you pull it up.
That I should be able to rigorously explain. Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
Right. So we were switching between this W and filters and representations, and I'm trying
Right.
to organize.
Right.
So which part here is a filter? It almost seems like the alpha evolving over time is some kind of filter representation or something.
So the alphas are not the filters, they are the representations. The filters are these things. So imagine, okay, let me do an illustration. So this is a cat looking at an image X, right? Now in the cat's brain, there's somewhere a filter that looks similar to that filter, right? And that would be a column from W. And what you're doing is essentially you're taking X, which is the input image, and you're multiplying by W transpose. So you're computing an inner product with each one of the filters, for example. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
And that gives you a certain response, right? A response which would be not alpha, but very related to alpha. I can explain what does it mean very related, but do the dimensions make sense, the objects?
Yeah. I'm thinking this is like a projection kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So essentially you have X, which is your input image, which is vectorized. And then you're calculating a correlation with each one of the rows in W. Each one of the rows in W is one of these filters. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what polarization filters are. Is this like something from EE?
Don't know.
And
It's like those physics that when you pass a light through it, like I don't know if it's called polarization.
Okay.
I just that came to mind.
And after you do W transpose X, you get a vector, which in this specific case would have how many entries? So this is filter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So alpha would be a vector of length 8, right? And so in this specific case, if you visualize alpha, alpha would have you know, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 8, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you would have a very big spike in alpha in the filter corresponding to this specific X, right? So this looks very similar to, I don't know, I guess this one, and that's number 6. So you'd have a very strong spike here. And the other orientations, which are similar to this one, would also have a small magnitude. Because a correlation between a filter and an X essentially is essentially going to measure how similar they are. If the filter is literally equal to the input X, then you're going to have a very large inner product. If the filter is kind of similar but not quite, then the inner product is going to be lower. If the filter is completely different than the image, then you're going to have very small numbers here.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But
I see.
I think the most intuitive way to think about this is maybe in that slide. Just think of X equal to sum over Wi alpha I from 1 to 8, where X is a vectorization of the image, and Wi are just vectorized filters, and alpha I are just scalars. So it's a linear combination of the filters that creates the image X.
Right.
But
and do we need some like orthonormality going on with W?
right, so essentially this specific slide is talking about an empirical experiment in the brain of the cat, right? So in the brain of the cat, you know, the cat doesn't, the brain of the cat does not speak linear algebra, so to speak. So there is no concept of orthogonality. But what you can do is, in this example, it's a very well-defined optimization problem, right? And in this specific optimization problem, you could ask yourself, what is the role of orthogonality of W? And there's a whole literature about this, which says that if W is close to being orthogonal, then you can prove certain things happen, right? So it's a very, very long answer to what you're asking. So the answer is that W does not have to be orthogonal, but it should be close to orthogonal.
Right.
Because being close to orthogonal is beneficial. Now you need to define what is close to orthogonal, but that's like a whole books. It's not even a lecture, it's books upon books.
Right. I can imagine some, yeah.
And the question of orthogonality becomes even more interesting once you have an overcomplete matrix W. Because if you have an overcomplete matrix W, it's like a wide matrix, right? Then you cannot have orthogonality because the number of vectors is higher than the dimension of the vectors, right? And then the question of orthogonality becomes even more interesting. Because you cannot have orthogonality, but you still want to have something that's close in some sense to orthogonality.
Interesting. Okay.
Why were you asking about orthogonality, by the way?
It just sort of popped into my head, but I guess you would want orthogonality to like well classify information or something. Like it would be great if you could express input data as just like an orthonormal basis, or in
Right.
an orthonormal basis.
Right. So that's what people were doing, you know, for ages, using orthonormal basis. But then they realized that orthonormal bases are very limited because orthonormal bases are, if you take an image and you try to represent it sparsely over a basis, then using an orthonormal basis would not lead to the best possible sparsity. it's more beneficial to have more elements, more columns, to have a very wide representation than to have a square representation.
Right.
I guess I'm not mentioning something. There is also a lot of evidence that people have gathered that natural data can be sparsified over different bases. Things like wavelet, for example, if you know what wavelet is, or things like edge selective filters. If you show data, if you show the response of data over edge selective filters, you would see that it has many zeros in the representation, or numbers that are very close to zero. And because of that, it means that if you had an overcomplete basis, you would have more of these different orientations, for example, and then you would be able to get even something sparser.
Right. I see. I think in my mind, I think of sparsity as a bad thing, and I want to trim it down. So perhaps that's a goal for the course for me.
You think of it as a bad thing. Why do you think of it as a bad thing?
It just seems that, like, I think about wasted space on a conceptual level, and it would be nice to make things tight.
But if you look at this efficient coding hypothesis, it's saying the opposite, right? In this efficient coding hypothesis, this researcher, Horace Barlow, was basically saying that why do you want an efficient code? If you think about the way the brain works, if every time you thought about something, the whole brain would lit up, then you would have a lot of energy consumption, right? Think of the brain as a computer. If the computer is using dense operations, which are not sparse, then you would require a lot of energy. That's why I think he was proposing this efficient coding hypothesis. He was trying to say that for efficiency reasons only, you would want your signals in the brain to be very sparse. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm just explaining what I understand from what they're saying. You should listen to neuroscientists, ask them what they think about this.
Fair enough.
There's probably also like evolutionary reasons why your brain get to become like that. You could hypothesize.
Yeah.
The more efficient, the better. That means, yeah.
Yeah.
That answers all my questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I was just listening in. It's really cool.
Sorry, I have a question on activation maximization. Can I ask?
Yeah.
There's something I can't understand. These psychedelic pictures, how did you produce them? I mean, I think that for each pixel in each figure, you just considered the optimization problem in the previous slide and produced the pre-image. Is that right?
Yeah.
And in these figures, conv2 means the second layer, conv3 means, and we should expect that as we proceed to the next layers, we should expect more specific data on the figures, yeah?
Right, exactly.
But on the fourth layer, we can see some faces but on the fifth layer, things are getting mixed up. I mean, the information on the fourth layer is somehow more meaningful, informative.
Right. I think the reason is that the information in the fifth layer is overlapping in some sense. It's like you have how can I say this? Like if you look at here, you can see there's something here that just appears from different directions, right? But I agree with you that conv4 seems to be, in this specific case, more semantically meaningful. But I guess here, I don't know. It's just empirical experiments. Maybe you shouldn't believe too much to empirical experiments. It's just, it shows that there seems to be something that's being learned, and that thing is a high-level concept, right? That's what these experiments are trying to say.
Maybe it's because that we have less elements in the fifth layer comparing to fourth layer, and maybe that's why they're overlapping.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, maybe.
And another question: why should we see these pictures? I mean, it's kind of neuroscientific problem, but and I don't expect that you have a solid answer for it. But I mean, these are actually psychedelic images, and I mean, is this a coincidence that in these layers we are observing these pictures, or I mean, in terms of colors and the shapes? And
I don't think it's a coincidence. I think there is a reason, but I think the reason is not well understood, which is why it's a mystery, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have my hypothesis, for why we might be seeing this, but it's just a hypothesis. Maybe you shouldn't confuse, I don't want to confuse you with my hypothesis. Maybe you should create your own hypothesis for why we might see this, right?
Okay.
I can tell you that my hypothesis in a nutshell is related to the efficient coding hypothesis. That the efficient coding hypothesis says that the brain of a human being would try to represent images in an efficient manner, where efficiency can be measured by sparsity, right?
Yeah.
And we can see that the first layers of the network are showing filters that are obtained from sparsity.
Yeah, exactly.
So my hypothesis is that all the layers are working based on sparsity, that sparsity is somehow the driving force behind all the layers, not just the first layer. And that the reason you see these very specific pictures is because they're essentially they're the results that you would obtain if you were to promote a sparse representation inside a network. I don't know if this makes any sense, but that's kind of my hypothesis / intuition. Do you have your own hypothesis, maybe, why we might see this?
Actually, I'm a bit confused because for the first layer, we could visualize the filters or the kernels because it was because of RGB channels.
Right.
But for the second or the other layers, we couldn't, and then we had this activation maximization process.
Exactly.
And then we solved an inverse problem, and the solution of the inverse problem are these figures.
Right.
And that's where I'm confusing, because I can't track the process. I mean,
you mean the process of solving the problem?
No, the process of the solving, I can understand it. I know, but I mean, I don't have any intuition why we should expect these figures. I mean, that's a big question in my head. I mean, I have some intuition or some hypothesis about the first layer. I mean, I can understand why I have some intuition why maybe. I mean, I can feel it. I can't explain. But for the other layers, I don't get it. I mean,
yes. I mean, what would it mean for you to understand this? What is understanding? This is every discussion in deep learning, I feel like, converges to, philosophical questions. I feel like Neo is a philosopher. Maybe he can, right? You said you're an expert philosopher. No? Okay. But
study philosophy as a degree.
Okay, so I think that's by definition making you an expert philosopher. So maybe near, but what does it mean, you know, for us to understand the filters in a deep layer? To me, understanding means that we can say that these filters are the result of some well understood optimization problem that enforces some type of a property on the representations. Like, what does it mean for me to understand this? For me to understand this means that I know this emerges if you force the first layer representation to be sparse. But what does it mean for us to understand this? If you were able to tell me that, you know, minimization of some function f over the representation would lead to this type of representations, then you could say that you understand why this emerges. Like, what's the underlying function that is being minimized? That's one way of understanding, but I don't know, there might be different ways of claiming understanding.
Yeah, I was thinking about a similar, in a similar way. I mean, if we can say what is the function that we're minimizing, maybe, but because it's an inverse problem, it's a complicated inverse problem.
Very complicated.
Yeah, that's why I can't figure out. I mean, I can't figure out what the interpretation is. I mean, why should we see something like this?
I can offer you a small intuition. So let me show you one equation that might be intuitive a bit. Imagine you have a network which is a multi-layer perceptron with no biases. Then the network can be written as X multiplied by W1 multiplied by D1, W2, D2, W3, let's say.
Yeah.
So W are the matrices, the weight matrices, and these are the masks, right? The D1,
Yeah.
D2. Now, imagine we try to solve the optimization problem that was written there. It's equivalent to saying that this should be equal to some one-hot vector, E1.
Exactly.
Now, imagine that I do the following. Imagine an alternative idea where you start from the one-hot vector and you try to recreate X through multiplications by the transpose matrices. So you do E1 multiplied by W3 transpose multiplied by D2 multiplied by W2 transpose multiplied by D1 multiplied by W1 transpose. Does this make sense?
Yeah, somehow.
It's as if, like, if you knew that these were, for example, square matrices and unitary matrices, for example, then
Okay.
this might make sense, or
Yeah.
under certain conditions, this might make sense. Now, then what does this operate? What do these operations do? So this operation, W1 transpose, is a matrix that contains edges, right? W2 is a matrix that might be combining those edges to create some higher level, you know, object. And W3 is combining the higher level objects into an even higher level object. And E1 is choosing one column out of this whole thing. Does this make sense or no?
Yeah. I'm thinking about something that maybe this is, maybe it's a possible interpretation that what we're seeing in those figures, those pictures, is somehow a backward behavior of the network, even if the input is a unity vector. I mean,
Exactly.
one shot
So
vector.
in fact, the first person who visualized the networks literally did what you just said. So he took a one-hot vector inside a network and he multiplied by these type of things. He basically did this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how he created those images. But since then, people have proposed, you know, other ways that produce more beautiful pictures. So I chose the other ways that produce more beautiful pictures over the original method that was maybe more principled in some sense.
Nice.
So I think your intuition about, choosing a one-hot vector and somehow inverting the network is definitely correct.
And did they verify it? I mean, if they input one of these pictures, they receive an output as a one-hot vector? I mean,
I think it's due to the optimization problem it's going to happen, right? I guess it depends on like how much lambda you put here. Maybe there is a Lagrange parameter that, but if you ignore this, this prior, then by the definition of the optimization problem, you would find an X that minimizes the discrepancy, right?
Yeah.
Like this optimization problem, if you solve it properly, it should satisfy that the feature is a one-hot.
but you didn't specify exactly what is the loss function for this optimization problem.
Yeah, because they use something very strange, but you can think of this as like mean squared error loss.
Oh, okay.
But they do some, let's say, unpleasant things. Unpleasant to explain, unpleasant to think about.
Sorry, I have a really dumb question. I thought I understood this, but I was a bit confused. So if you look at conv1, these are filters, right?
Right.
Wait, but then when the
it's okay. It's both it's basically the pre-image. The pre-image is not the filter unless you're in the first layer, in which case it is the filter. Right? Because in the first layer of the network, your convolution is meeting the image, right? So if you try to maximize if you try to find a pre-image that maximizes, the first filter, you would just get the first filter.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
It's kind of confusing, but deeper, it becomes highly non-trivial. What is the image that maximizes a certain neuron? Because deeper inside the network, the neuron is a result of a nonlinear function, right?
Mm-hmm. I have a question for the tree frog, black swan, goose pictures. Are those, for example, is it like what kind of image would you put into the algorithm that would produce the closest thing to like the quintessential black swan according to? Why doesn't this produce the filter? I'm so confused here.
Why doesn't it produce the filter?
Oh, I see. Oh, I see what you mean. So, so what's happening is the question is, what produces like a one-hot vector output? If you chop all the remaining layers and only have the first layer, what's the one that would produce a one-hot vector? And that would be the filter because it would just be perfectly matching.
So you have a function, so you have a network that obtains as input X, right, which is the input image. And then you have the network that goes to the logits, right? So you're asking, what is the input that would maximize the logit of a goose? So you're optimizing over the image.
I see. That makes sense now. Sorry, I was confused because I was thinking the other way, but everything makes sense now.
Yeah, it's not visualization of filters, it's visualization of an input that maximizes a filter. But people call it visualization of filters. But I guess that's a bad name, perhaps.
Sort of progress on how deep you go into the layer. So you're going to produce a vector at, let's say, the third layer. And your question is, if I pick this neuron, what is the image that I put in that would, up to this stage, maximize that one hot here?
Precisely.
You go all the way until the end, and then you have the goose and black swan thing. But in the first layer, if you have the neuron corresponds to a filter, and the one that maximizes this would be the filter itself.
Precisely.
Because you take it. Okay.
I feel like you should replace me instead of you can do the lecture. I'll give you the slides.
No. Thank you so much. This is helpful.
Has anyone looked at the whole null space that maps to that one? I mean, do you know what I mean?
Not that I'm aware of. Not
Would that
I'm
even
aware
be a
of.
useful thing to do?
It is an interesting question because there's literature in signal processing in the 90s that was talking about how if you have they were trying to design features, handcrafted features, so to speak, or handcrafted filters, right? And those handcrafted filters were called wavelets. So they were kind of, it looks something like this, maybe something like this is a wavelet. Now there, the idea was that if you have a signal, based on my memory, which is a low degree polynomial, let's say you have a function that looks like a polynomial, and then there is a discontinuity, and then another polynomial, and then discontinuity, right? The idea was that if you apply these specific filters, there would be 0 in all the places except the discontinuities. And so the null space of those filters was what was important. The fact that those filters, okay, so here's the idea. If you have a function here, let's say a polynomial of x, which is of degree, I don't know, d. If d is not too high, then you can prove that this filter is going to produce a 0, right? Because it produces 0 for every monomial, which is low degree. And so in those specific works, the null space of the filters seem to be very important property. Does this make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
But in deep networks, I have not seen anyone analyze the null space. So I think that the question is definitely motivated based on research in signal processing. I just haven't seen anyone study that.
I'm just thinking about measuring how bad a network is. Like, you know, sometimes you'll feed it a picture of a goose and it thinks it's a cheeseburger or whatever. And so I'm just thinking
that's
about
next lecture.
Oh, okay. GANs and stuff, right? But I'm just thinking about like the inverse curves that you'll get, or hyperplanes, or like whatever. And then you can sort of just look at that for two different objects and what the intersection looks like, and you know.
Yes. I don't
Maybe
see
then you can
how do you calculate the intersections though of a goose and a cheeseburger?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking like if you characterize the inverse, I'll just say inverse images, right? And then and then if you fit via like high degree or multi-dimensional Taylor series or something, then you can have like two manifolds, and then you can like do intersection theory on them.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, I don't think anyone did that. Sounds interesting. So you have a function, it's the inverse function. You have another inverse. By the way, there's a whole literature on people who want their networks to be invertible. And there's many papers on that. It's called, I think it has a name, something like flow, inverse flow. So people are interested in networks that satisfy what you want them to satisfy. But then trying to invert a network and intersect, it sounds impossible to do empirically. I like the idea, but empirically it sounds impossible.
Right. Well, I guess you could you do some like gradient descent on, so given an inverse image like this cheeseburger here, can you then do some sort of like parameter exploration around that image?
That's exactly what next lecture. So next lecture is about adversarial examples. An adversarial example is the following idea. Imagine you take a network that says a cheeseburger is a cheeseburger, right? And then you add a tiny perturbation to the input that makes the network think that a cheeseburger is actually a goose, right? So you can optimize over the perturbation, and you can find many, many, many different adversarial examples around an image that would completely fool the network.
Right.
Is that what you were thinking about?
Yeah, it seems like I'm kind of reconstructing GANs in like, and I just want it to be in a really hyper rigorous way or something. I don't know. I'll think about it.
Yeah, very interesting question. Bye-bye.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.